Buddhism is said to be the fastest growing religion and one of the most influential spiritual movements in North America and Europe. It has become clear that Buddhism is playing a significant role in the new planetary culture, and one quite different from the usual East-West encounters of the past. Even though Western civilization has been aware of Buddhism for 2,000 years, it is only within the very recent past that the West has emerged from its previous cultural arrogance with respect to this remarkably practical spiritual path. Therein lies a fascinating story, and it forms the focus for our program today with our guest, Stephen Batchelor. Stephen Batchelor was born in Scotland and educated both in England and in Buddhist monasteries in India, Korea, and Switzerland. He's a renowned Buddhist teacher and scholar, the author of The Faith to Doubt, Glimpses of Buddhist Uncertainty, Alone with Others, An Existential Approach to Buddhism, and the award-winning The Tibet Guide. He's also the author of The Awakening of the West, The Encounter of Buddhism and Western Culture. Join us for the next hour as we explore the extraordinary path of Buddhism with our guest, Stephen Batchelor. My name is Michael Toms. I'll be your host. Welcome to New Dimensions. Stephen, welcome.
I'm glad to be here.
So when did you first become exposed to Buddhism yourself?
This occurred for me in the early 1970s. I left high school at the age of 18, and instead of going into university, I chose to travel overland to India, which took me 6 months or so, and I ended up in Dharamsala, the capital in exile of the Dalai Lama. And I studied there for 3 years initially, during which time I became a Tibetan Buddhist monk. And after that, I went to Switzerland to another monastery with my teacher, who had been appointed abbot there. And I studied primarily philosophy and psychology, epistemology, logic for a further 4 years. After that, I chose to focus my practice more in direct meditational experience, and this took me to South Korea, where I trained for 4 years in a Zen monastery. After that, I returned to England, where I married, and I now live in a non-denominational Buddhist community there.
When you went to India, did you have the intention of becoming a monk or learning this? How did that?
No, not at all. When I left England, I had no intention of even going to India. It was somewhat in the atmosphere at that time that travel meant ultimately going east. But I sort of drifted out there, really, and when I arrived in Dharamsala, it was almost by chance that I stumbled upon an institute that had just opened that was offering courses in Buddhism to Westerners. I enrolled and I just stayed there, and in a sense my life changed at that point from one of traveling, as it were, on the outer surface of the world and moving into what one might call an inner journey of discovery of the realms of mind, spirit, and so on. And I hadn't intended to become a monk. I hadn't really thought of these things. It just seemed that in the course of my studies, that if I were to really take this seriously, which I increasingly felt I should, that would be the logical thing to do, that it would enable me to have a lifestyle that would be entirely dedicated to the practices and the studies that I most wish to do. So for that reason, I became a monk.
So spending 7 years with the Tibetans in 2 different monasteries, what led you to Korea? How did that jump take place?
Well, it's a fairly complex story. I was training in the Gelugpa tradition of Tibetan Buddhism that emphasizes a firm scholarly understanding of Buddhist philosophy, a good underpinning in what Buddhism is actually about. So I learned the language, both the spoken and the classical languages of Tibetan. I studied many texts, and I found this extremely enriching But I did feel that there was perhaps too much of an emphasis on the scholarly aspect, and I felt I was getting a little bit imbalanced. So I sought to balance that out with a more focused meditational training. I did initially consider going into a lengthy 3-year retreat under Tibetan guidance, but I found that those kinds of retreats too also seemed somewhat complex in the details of mandalas and so on that one had to familiarize oneself with. And for many years I'd been drawn to the directness and the paradoxes and the kind of earthiness of Zen Buddhism. And this led me to seek a teacher in that tradition. I chose Korea because the monastic tradition, as in Tibetan Buddhism, was still preserved, and I could live as a monk, and I could undergo a training that was far more intense than it would have been had I gone to Japan. We sat in meditation for three months at a time, twice a year, and focusing on a very simple question: what is this? And that was it. And I loved it. It's marvelous.
So how would you contrast your experience with Zen and your experience with Tibetan Buddhism? How would you describe the differences to someone who, say, had never heard of Buddhism or just was learning about Buddhism?
Well, Tibetan Buddhism has the great strength of being extremely comprehensive. It probably is the only Buddhist school that really retains the full complexity of a living Buddhist culture. There is the reflections, the meditations, the philosophy, the psychology. It's extraordinarily rich. Whereas in Zen, you have a very single-pointed focusing on a very basic question. No philosophy, no psychology, no epistemology. As soon as I would get into a discussion with my Zen teacher of any of these sorts of issues, I'd try to discuss it with him, I'd try to argue with him in any way. He'd follow that to a point, and then he would say, "But do you really understand? Do you really know?" And I would sort of find myself unable to say anything, really. And so he said, "Go back and sit." And that, after a short while, I realized that that was all that I was really there to do, was to simply focus on the basic questions. But what I found, unexpectedly perhaps, was that in that very pared down meditative practice, that this brought me to appreciate the depths of the studies that I'd been doing with the Tibetans. And I found the two went together extremely well. One, the Zennis, as it were, provided me with a kind of vertical dimension that added depth to the horizontal richness of Tibetan Buddhism. I don't see them at all in contrast or conflict. I find that they merge and support each other extremely well.
So 11 years in the monastery, living a monastic existence, what prompted you to leave and pursue a different kind of life?
A number of things. My teacher died, my Zen teacher died, and with his death, the Zen monastery really underwent a great change. There wasn't really a successor to him. Also, I had completed the period of training I had committed myself to when I first arrived. When I'd left Europe 4 years before, I had already felt that I didn't really wish to play the role of a Buddhist monk in a European context. I felt that the sheer presence of the monastic robe and the shaved head tended to create a barrier between me and others. The people related to me as a representative of an institution rather than as another human being. So I already had severe doubts about living in the West as a monk. The third factor, perhaps the crucial one, was that I fell in love with my wife. And she was also living in Korea. And we decided that we would return together. So we disrobed. She was a nun.
Ah.
and we then settled in this community in Britain.
Mm-hmm. So she had also Buddhist experience.
Oh yes, indeed. No, she had been training in Zen Buddhism for about 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I'm speaking with Stephen Batchelor, author of The Awakening of the West. We're going to continue our exploration of Buddhism in just a moment. My name is Michael Toms. You're listening to New Dimensions. Stephen, probably most of our listeners are not aware that Westerners have been exposed to Buddhism going way, way back, 2,000 years ago. I mean, Alexander the Great came in contact, and some of his successors. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that, how far back the contact goes.
The contact, there is in fact a mention in the early Buddhist scriptures where the Buddha uses the example of the Greeks in India to make a point about the caste system. But it seems unlikely that the Buddha had actually encountered Greeks because the Greek communities were a long way from where he was teaching. Alexander the Great, it doesn't seem, would actually have met Buddhist monks. It's, in all likelihood, he met what we would call sadhus today, wandering ascetics. Perhaps they were Jains, but almost certainly not Buddhists. It wasn't until the subsequent Greek invasions of Menander, about 300 years later, that there was an encounter between Greek rulers and citizens living in India, in colonies, who became absorbed into the Buddhist culture of northwest India. And that was quite a profound process of assimilation. And it affected the Indian Buddhists, in a sense, perhaps in a longer term way than it did the Greeks. The image of the Buddha, for example, was the creation of the Greeks. Until the Greek communities, there was no representation of the Buddha in a human form.
Yeah, I found that very interesting. I never knew that.
It's an amazing piece of information, and that, of course, has been vital to the spread of Buddhism and to our awareness of it, is the image of the Buddha himself as a human being.
And it was based on Apollo, the image of Apollo.
That's right, yeah.
So right, almost back to the mythic origins of Buddhism, we have this connection.
That's right.
Amazing.
Indeed,
yeah.
Indeed. But what's strange also is that knowledge that the Greeks in India had of Buddhism did not go back to Greece itself. And the Greeks remained quite ignorant of Buddhism and anything it meant. There was a sort of vague sense by the Neoplatonists of Indian philosophy in general, but never to the point where they would be able to distinguish between the different currents within those traditions. The next meeting after the Greek colonists in India was not until the 13th century, with the first Christian friars who went out to negotiate with the Mongol Khans, who at that time had expanded through both Asia and the Middle East, Russia, Eastern Europe. And these first contacts were like 1700 years after the time of the Buddha. At that time, both Christianity in Europe had expanded into a very rich and very mature tradition. Buddhism, likewise, in Asia had expanded throughout China and Japan by that period, Tibet, and yet the two cultures had grown up in basically ignorance of one another, which is so surprising from our point of view now, that the world was such a larger place there.
What about the idea that, weren't there Buddhist traders traveling through the Holy Land around the time of Christ?
Yes.
I've often wondered, because there's so many parallels in the Gnostic tradition to Buddhism that it seems almost a sure bet that there was some exchange of information going on.
There certainly was exchange of information. You find, for example, in the fables of Aesop, stories which you also find in the Buddhist Jataka or birth tales. It seems very likely that the very story of Christ in the Gospels was modeled to some extent on the story of the Buddha, the biography of the Buddha. We had a folk culture existing between Asia and Europe that was conveyed by the trade routes, by the merchants. And stories were told. And the difficulty, though, is to know where they came, who started them first. Probably both sources influenced each other. And at that level, certainly there was a sort of common culture emerging. The Gnostics, particularly Mani, and the founder of Manichaeism, was aware of the Buddha and saw himself as the fulfillment of the prophetic tradition from Buddha, Zoroaster, Christ, and Mani. And very probably many of the other Gnostic teachers were influenced by Indian ideas. But only one of them, and that's Basilides, who's not such a well-known Gnostic, was probably influenced by a specific form of Buddhism. So yes, there were cross-currents, but never to the point where there was a clear understanding either in Asia of the Eastern Mediterranean traditions or in Europe of the Buddhist or Hindu traditions.
Going back to what you said about the Westerners really making contact with the Mongols in around the 13th century or so, the reason they went there was basically to convert the Mongols, right? I mean, that was part of the idea, wasn't it?
Yes, that was the entire idea, that the Mongols were a tribal people who burst out of the steppes. They were not a cultured people at all, and they dominated these very civilized areas of the world and sought to draw from those cultures. The Chinese, the Tibetans, the Persians, the Christians.
And they were knocking on the doors.
They were all knocking on the door of the Khan saying, we've got the truth. Listen to us. Become a Muslim, become a Christian, become a Buddhist. And the Khan, in the middle of the 13th century, set up a debate between these conflicting religious groups. And it really was the first time in which such a diversity of religious opinion was put on a similar platform. And their views were discussed. In the end, the Mongols opted for Buddhism, at least the Mongols in China. And Kublai Khan became a Tibetan Buddhist. Christianity never really took off. It was felt to be too exclusive by the Mongols. The friars, in particular William of Rubruck, from whom we have the best record, was actually evicted by the Mongols for being intolerant.
Interesting, yeah. Yeah, it's remarkable too how in some ways that dynamic continued over centuries.
No, indeed. In the next phase after that of the 13th century, we have the Jesuits, highly intelligent men of the Renaissance, but very fanatic Christians, and they sought to convert the heathen Buddhists and Muslims and Hindus and everyone else to what was true. It was not possible for them really to enter into dialogue for the simple reason that they perceived themselves as holding the truth, and by definition everyone else was in error. Buddhism was perceived as a creation of the devil. And so you have a very hostile encounter. The Buddhists often welcomed the Christian missionaries into their temples and monasteries, but quite quickly found out that there was not really any reciprocal friendship being returned, and that they were really being perceived by these Europeans as inferior specimens, really. It was very sad. Really very sad, I think, but very symptomatic of those times. And the Jesuits, of course, were very much linked in with the whole expansion of European colonialism. They were, as it were, the vanguard of the West's attempt to dominate the East. And in a sense, they succeeded. Not in the short term, but in the long term, of course, the West has managed to project its philosophical beliefs, its religious beliefs, its political beliefs, pretty much over the entire surface of the world. And we witness the fruits of it today.
So this marriage of religion and politics has had a great deal to do with forming the world that we live in today.
Oh, indeed, yes. What I found very interesting in doing this study of the history of Buddhism and the West is to see Western history in the broadest strokes, to see how so much of what we experience today is the result of many hundreds of years of interaction, of hostility, of struggle. And we bear the fruits of that. The irony, of course, is that while the West, in a sense, has dominated the world economically and to some extent politically, that very dominance has been accompanied by a breakdown in its own spiritual, religious sense, its own sense of purpose, direction, meaning. And ironically, we find Buddhism and Hinduism and Taoism penetrating the West in very calm and peaceful and unobtrusive ways, and working towards a healing of that very crisis that the West has brought itself to.
Was it Kublai Khan that became a Tibetan Buddhist? Was it?
Yes, it was Kublai.
Yeah. So there's still the connection between the Mongolians and the Tibetans still continues to this day, doesn't it?
Indeed, yes. The Mongols became, after being converted to Tibetan Buddhism, Mongolia became a Buddhist state, very much on the lines of Tibet. They had the Grand Hutuktu Lama in Urga, which is now Ulaanbaatar. And he ruled, much as the Dalai Lama ruled in Tibet. And recently, now that Mongolia has broken away from the influence of the former Soviet Union, that Mongolian Buddhist culture is in a very strong mode of resurgence, starting again.
The Dalai Lama visited Mongolia.
He did.
Yeah.
Yes, he did. He did. You also have Mongolian Buddhist communities in Russia, in the Russian Federation, in Buryatia, which are also reviving now. In fact, the very first Buddhist temple in Europe was in St. Petersburg, and this was a Mongol Buryat Tibetan Buddhist temple. So there has been, through the East, a great influence. Had there not been the communist takeover in 1917, it's very possible the West would have had the reception of Buddhism coming actually through Russia, but that, of course, was stopped.
Mm-hmm. Also, weren't there some Chinese-Tibetan partnerships over the centuries that, of course, forgetting about the contemporary times, but going back some time, weren't there some real close connections there?
Periodically there were Chinese emperors who were very devoted to Tibetan lamas. In the imperial court in China, through the Ming and Manchu periods, Tibetan lamas were employed often as kind of magicians, as it were, who would recite prayers and do rituals and pujas and so on in order to preserve the harmony of the Chinese state. But some of the emperors certainly seem to have a personal commitment to the teachings of Tibetan Buddhism. But this fluctuated very much with the dynasties. Very much.
Wasn't I know that, I think I recall the Tai Situ and the Satupa lineage being early on sponsored or having a connection with Chinese.
Well, Tai is, of course, the Chinese word for great. It's a Chinese title. In the Ming period in particular, this is like the 14th, 15th centuries, many Tibetan lamas were invited by the emperor and they were given these grandiose titles, the Karmapa, the Taisitupa. Tsongkhapa of the Gelug was also invited. There was quite a traffic between the two cultures, indeed.
And so the position now that the nation of China takes with respect to Tibet, saying that it's always been part of China, as a historian and a scholar, what would you say to that?
Well, it's a very bogus claim. The periods in which China had the most influence over Tibet were during the Yuan period, or the Mongol period, and latterly during the Manchu period. And what's interesting is that both...
And these in point of time would be when?
Well, the Yuan period was in the 13th century, Kublai Khan. The Manchu period from the beginning of the 18th century until the beginning of the 20th century. What's interesting is that both of those dynasties were not Chinese dynasties. They were dynasties ruled by Mongolians and Manchurians who took over the Chinese empire. And at that time there were certainly very strong links. But to call on that basis Tibet a part of China is an extremely spurious claim. But that doesn't undermine the fact, and this is in a sense what is troubling, is that Chinese today, the vast majority of Chinese, do believe that Tibet is the backyard of China, and the Tibetans are a rather unruly group of Chinese. The historical arguments notwithstanding, the fact remains that the Chinese perceive Tibet in that way, and it's not just the communists, the nationalists, even the student leaders in Tiananmen Square believe Tibet to be part of China. And that is the problem, I think, because the Chinese don't actually see it as a subject which is open for discussion. They're so deeply immured in that perception.
We're going to continue our exploration of Tibet and Buddhism in general with our guest, Stephen Batchelor, in just a moment. My name is Michael Toms. You're listening to New Dimensions. My guest is Stephen Batchelor, author of The Tibet Guide, The Awakening of the West, and The Faith to Doubt, Glimpses of Buddhist Uncertainty. And we're exploring the way Buddhism has come into the West and the history of Buddhism in some sense. And we're coming up to talking about the East-West encounter with Buddhism and Western civilization in more contemporary terms. And so we might want to do that at this point, since we brought up the current political situation with China and Tibet. It's only been within the last 20, 30 years that Buddhism has really taken off in the West, isn't it, Stephen?
That's right. The practice of Buddhism by Westerners began at the beginning of this century only. And there was a very gradual increase in interest through the first 50 years of the century. It was only in the late 50s and the 60s that this kind of exploded exponentially. And in the last 20 years, there have been a huge growth in the number of Buddhist teachers who are active in the West today, the number of Buddhist centers, vast amounts of books on the subject and tapes and all of these things. And that is quite amazing, really, the extent of that.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think the Westerners, particularly younger Westerners, have gravitated to Buddhism in this way?
I think there are a number of reasons. I think Buddhism is seen as a spiritual tradition that is free from many of the rather uncomfortable trappings of traditional religion. There's not expected of you to start with a belief in, say, God or Christ, and then start from there. Instead, Buddhism addresses the immediacy of your own experience. Buddhism starts with the recognition that life contains pain and suffering, and not just physical pain, but a kind of spiritual malaise, an anxiety, a sense of meaninglessness. And this analysis of the human condition is not presented as a kind of dogma, but it's presented as something for you to consider. And the tools for that consideration, meditation, reflection, and various other kinds of practices, enable you to look deeply into your own experience in such a way that you get a first-hand encounter with life in a way that perhaps has greater clarity, greater depth than you would otherwise have had. And Buddhism then goes on to explain how we can live a life in all our aspects, our ethical life, our livelihood, our spiritual life, our economic life, in such a way that we can become increasingly aware of the nature of our existence. We can get a deeper understanding of those habits and patterns of the mind that cause us to repeatedly cause ourselves pain. It can lead to a greater sensitivity, wisdom, compassion, love, and in a context of a practice, something you can actually do. And the test of Buddhist practice is not that you conform to some belief system, but that you actually free yourself from what restricts you in your own life. So I think it's the practicality of Buddhism, the incisiveness of its philosophy and its psychology, that has drawn a lot of people who experience the spiritual crisis in the West to come to this tradition that seems to be alive in a way that many aspects of Christianity are not.
I've always been intrigued by the number of Roman Catholic trained persons that have come to Buddhism.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting, particularly Tibetan Buddhism.
Yes.
And I guess the parallels of the comprehensiveness of the religion has something to do with that.
I think it's very interesting to see what kind of people are drawn to what kinds of Buddhism. And I don't think anybody's really studied it, but certainly we are attracted to those forms of Buddhism that somehow have resonances with our own culture. Buddhism is not a denial of the West or a denial of Christianity at all. It's simply a system of methods, of ways of living that in many senses allow us to fulfill those intuitions and feelings that we didn't feel were being fulfilled in, say, Christianity. Some people find through Buddhism they're actually brought back to Christianity. They find that through their meditation practice they get an insight into what the Gospels really mean. And I don't think Buddhism is concerned really about converting the world or groups of people to Buddhism as such. It's concerned really with freeing the mind, with opening up the potentials that the mind contains. It's about reducing suffering in the world. It doesn't really matter if you're a Buddhist or a Christian or whatever. That really is secondary.
So in some sense, all of those Buddhist teachers that have come to the West should not really be considered missionaries, but it should be, how should they be looked at or viewed?
Well, it varies. One has to recognize that we're dealing with human beings here. And there are Buddhist organizations that are quite missionary, quite explicitly missionary in nature, who do seek to convert Western people, anyone, to Buddhism and to have them become card-carrying Buddhists of a certain school. There's quite a panoply of different approaches from the different teachers. It's certainly not reducible to any stereotype. You have people like the Dalai Lama who's certainly not interested in converting people to Buddhism, but you have others who are. So one has to be discerning. One has to not to try to break out of the habit of wanting to reduce something which is foreign and other and unknown into sort of simple stereotypes that maybe make it easier to handle, but in fact conceal the complexity and the richness and the diversity of what's actually going on.
We in the West have this marvelous capacity of labeling and compartmentalizing everything we see that isn't us, and
exactly.
Trying to define it in some way. And so I think, as you point out, it's important to recognize that Buddhism is extremely vast. It's difficult to compartmentalize.
Yeah, we have to speak really perhaps of Buddhisms, and perhaps even to challenge the very concept of an ism. After all, there's no equivalent term in any Asian language for Buddhism.
Right.
The Buddhists talk of the Dharma, and the Dharma is one of these notorious words that eludes translation. We could call it the way, the truth.
Much like the Tao
law,
or Nirvana.
It's a term that you understand only really through living according to the values of Buddhist tradition, and then you begin to get a feel for what the Dharma is. The Buddhists are concerned about people living in accordance with the Dharma.
Well, it's much like Jesus. He probably, if he came back today, probably wouldn't be a Christian. But it's like the Buddha probably wouldn't be a Buddhist, It's kind of in some ways, when you identify yourself with a religion, you identify yourself as somehow, almost it's paradoxical. You almost are in opposition to the principles of the very founder or the person from which that religion came.
No, this is absolutely true. Absolutely true. It's an interesting question to ask, well, what would the Buddha say if he were here today? Would he speak of reincarnation and karma and these very Asian ideas, or would he simply adopt the metaphors, the languages, the ideas that resonate with people today? I suspect, of course, he would. I don't think the Buddha would be interested in supporting what we now call Buddhism. But again, you see, the Buddha, although he was an historical person, has meaning for Buddhists because he embodied a certain realization, a certain understanding of life and death. And that understanding is not one that is exclusive to that historical figure, but is an open possibility to any single person. So we can say that the Buddha can be in the West today. Anyone who has, to some degree, embodied that state of enlightenment that the Buddha himself attained is authorized, as it were, or is challenged to find means of articulating that understanding in a way that's comprehensible, meaningful, challenging, and accessible to you and I, to anybody in the world who is concerned about issues of meaning, about issues of what is life really for. So the challenge of Buddhism is about finding a language that speaks to the modern world. I wouldn't even say the West. We're in an increasingly globalized culture, and the challenge of Buddhism is to become global. That is my feeling. Not to retain with any strong attachment its identification with Tibet or Japan or the Theravada or the Mahayana or any of these schools.
Well, this brings up my next question, which has to do with the tradition of many of these schools of Buddhism, particularly in the Tibetan tradition. You have this rather, amazing, because it's lasted 1,000 years, this tradition, these traditions and the kinds of empowerments and prayers and mantras that have been said over and over again for centuries, and to bring those into the West. What I hear you suggesting is that perhaps these will need to be discarded at some point, and something new will emerge out of the contemporary moment.
Not necessarily. Each time Buddhism has entered into a culture which is new, and it's done this many times, it has brought with it a body of practices, a body of philosophy, a body of understanding the world in a certain way. And this, of course, has to be preserved for there to be a recognizable continuity of the Dharma, of the Buddhist tradition. And the balancing act is always that of retaining what is essential, discarding what is merely a cultural accretion that may have been valuable in Tibet or China or Japan, but is not really relevant any longer to the kind of world we live in today. So the big question really is what is essential? Perhaps the continuity of the recitation of certain mantras, initiations, and so on. This does carry something very essential, perhaps not in the form we have it today. Perhaps there is something essential in that form. And these are questions I can't answer. I doubt anybody really can see that, because we're talking about a process of interaction which is really rather organic in nature. We need to plant these seeds in the soil of the world today and nurture them and see which ones grow, which ones thrive, and which ones don't. And it's not really our business to be, dogmatic about, well, this has to go and this has to stay.
It may take several generations for this transition to occur.
It has to. Again, historically, Buddhism has usually taken 300 to 400 years in moving from one cultural situation into another before it assumes a form that is characteristic of that culture, so that we can actually say Chinese Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, and it means something. The transplantation of Buddhism is much more akin to the transplantation of a large tree, more rapidly than ever before. Nonetheless, the actual growth of a culture as complex as that of Buddhism is not going to be speeded up by this. It's a question of an organic growth that will, as you say, take generations. It needs to be passed through and processed by successive peoples over long periods of time. We also have to accept that it may not take root, that all we can do is our best and be truthful to that.
Actually, it's kind of refreshing when one compares it with some of the other religious movements that are around today, where kind of like, particularly in the some of the Christian evangelical movements, which are very strongly oriented to a short period of time and quick conversion, and we've got to do it now, and not really a recognition of organic unfolding, and certainly not a recognition of it may not happen, but rather it has to happen. I'm speaking with Stephen Batchelor, author of The Awakening of the West, The Encounter of Buddhism and Western Culture. We're going to continue in just a moment. My name is Michael Toms. You're listening to New Dimensions. Earlier you had mentioned that, of course, your training was done in the Gelugpa tradition, and I think probably a lot of people aren't aware that there are a number of different schools particularly in Tibetan Buddhism, and you described the Gelugpa as scholarly. I wonder how you would describe the Nyingma and the Sakya and the Kagyu as. How would you do that?
I think one has to acknowledge that all the schools of Tibetan Buddhism contain the same basic elements. They all have scholarly traditions. They all have what one might call contemplative traditions or practice traditions. It's really a question of emphasis that has emerged over time. The Kagyupa and the Nyingmapa would generally be considered to be the more practice-oriented traditions. In other words, they would agree with the Gelugpa that yes, you need to have a clear understanding of what you're doing before you do it. But they would say, well, you don't need to spend 20 years getting that understanding, that if you spend, say, 4 or 5 years getting a clear grasp of these things, then the thing to do is really to go into formal meditation practice, into long retreats. The Sakyapa are perhaps more somewhere between the two. They do have a very strong scholarly tradition, as do the Gelugpa, and much of the Gelugpa's own scholarship is derived from the Sakyapa. But they also, especially recently, have an equally strong meditative tradition as well.
And certainly the tragedy of Tibet from 59 forward with the Chinese invasion paradoxically has brought really the wonders of Tibetan Buddhism to the West,
yes.
To the rest of the world. And it's hard to believe that these treasures were locked up for over 1,000 years in the wilds of Tibet, really insulated from the rest of the world. And if it wasn't for this tragedy, that we might still be the same. It's the same situation. Who knows? What about that paradox? What about that? What is your view?
Well, history is full of these ironies. And this is one of the greater ones, I suppose, that Tibet was, as it were, a kind of cold storage, where the Buddhism of India, that had likewise been obliterated by the invading Muslim armies of the 12th century, was preserved. But perhaps it was too rigidly preserved, that Tibet, as it were, seeked to cut itself off too much from the rest of the world. And it was its own craving for seclusion that was one of the causes of its own downfall. That the two are not unlinked.
They had no partners to come to their rescue when.
Well, they refused to make any partnerships. Yeah. I mean, they made a few attempts in the 1920s and 30s to connect in with the rest of the world, but it was too late by then, really. And the Dalai Lama himself has said that that we Tibetans are largely to blame for this. That there was a good window of opportunity from 1912 to 1949 in which international relations could have been established. There could have been more of an outgoing policy, but this was resisted by the monks, the abbots, the aristocracy, who felt that any incursions into the outside world would, as it were, despoil those very treasures that they preserved. It was a dilemma. They were probably right. If the outside world had come into Tibet in any form, it would have changed the situation. But the reality was that medieval Tibet could no longer survive in the modern geopolitical environment. Something was going to change. Unfortunately, what happened was a disaster of a major order. The people who did come in, the Chinese, and the extreme policies of the Cultural Revolution led to overwhelming destruction of the culture. There were 6,000 monasteries in 1959. By the end of the Cultural Revolution in 1976, there were only about 13 that hadn't been either completely destroyed or seriously desecrated and damaged. So they did suffer enormously in this period. 1.2 million Tibetans lost their lives in this struggle. So it's a huge tragedy in the world today, and one, unfortunately, which the West does not really seem prepared to rectify.
It's almost so large that we can't see it.
Exactly. Yeah.
We don't want to see it,
We don't want to see it because it exposes our implication in the kinds of government policies and so on that do support our standard of life.
In these ironies of history of when the Tibetans were being taken over by the Chinese, the Korean conflict was unfolding.
Exactly, yeah.
And that was taking everybody else's attention in the world. And then plus we didn't want to upset the Chinese too much, and et cetera, all these political kinds of machinations that have contributed to the tragedy. Yeah.
Exactly. But the bottom line really is that it was not in anybody's interests, economically or politically, to come to the aid of Tibet. That Tibet had nothing the rest of the world really wanted. There was no real political motive to do anything. And also the sheer inaccessibility of the place.
Yeah. It was interesting. There were a few hardy souls from the West that made their way through disguises and other means into Tibet between that period of 1912 and 1949. And we have their accounts today, which are quite amazing to read. I think of Enrique Gobinda and Alexander David Neal, of course, and Heinrich Harrer and others that had some amazing stories to tell.
Yes, that's right. We get a glimpse through their writings of a lost world. And that, I think, will increase with time the poignancy of their descriptions, which are very beautiful too often. They're very inspired.
I think of that movie that James Hilton made, Shangri-La, was so, in some ways it's like there was that magic of a Shangri-La that comes through those accounts that you read.
Interestingly, there is a project in Los Angeles to make a film of 7 Years in Tibet of Heinrich Harrer. That's currently, I think it might even be in production now.
Well, that'd be great. Be nice to see. Yeah. So what do you see the future being for Buddhism as this encounter continues? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, it's very tempting to speculate as to what is going to unfold. But on the other hand, the future is by definition open. And I remember once the Tibetan Lama was asked, what will be my future life? And the Lama said, it's very easy to find that out. You look into your present state of mind, and there you will see your future life. And that, I think, is true also on the broader scale. If we want to see what kind of Buddhism is going to emerge in the West, we have to see what we're doing now. We have to see to what extent we really are committed, to what extent we're not motivated by egoism or some kind of other personal or political agendas. We need to see the quality of our own practice as Buddhists will be the ground on which the future unfolds. So the responsibility is very much in the hands of those of us who are practicing Buddhism today. And Buddhism does not exist apart from that. It's not some ethereal entity that is sort of winding its way through history. It continues through its instantiation in the individual lives of those who practice it. That is what will determine the future. I hope that it brings a greater qualities of wisdom and compassion into the world that may seek and that may heal some of the tragedies that we're experiencing. That's my hope. But whether it will or not depends on the quality of my own life now.
Stephen, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you.
I've been speaking with Stephen Batchelor, author of The Awakening of the West, published by Parallax Press in paperback. If you'd like more information about the work of Stephen Batchelor or the books of Parallax Press, you can write to them. That's Parallax Press, Post Office Box 7355, Berkeley, California, 94707. That address again, Parallax Press, Post Office Box 7355, Berkeley, California, 94707. New Dimensions Radio is produced by New Dimensions Radio in San Francisco, California, USA, and is made possible by listener contributions and by the members of Friends of New Dimensions. My name is Michael Toms. On behalf of the New Dimensions radio staff and all those who are members of Friends of New Dimensions, I'm wishing you well. This is program number 2504.